We're now looking at an older version of GarageBand. This is the version that shipped with my Mac whenever I got it, and I really don't think I even opened it once until the past couple of days when I've been going in here and just kind of making this little 8-bar loop as an example for this course. And I know that there's a new version now that looks like Logic Pro X, but one of the things that we're trying to really drive home to you on this website across the board is that the programs that you're using aren't really that important. What's important is the person sitting behind the controls actually making the choices. And you can always make do with what you have, which is what I've pretty much done here working inside of GarageBand. So we're not going to go through and actually talk about all of the little features and this is what makes GarageBand unique. Rather, I just want to kind of show you where some of the limitations exist and how you have to kind of use those to your advantage when you're making music. And let's start by actually opening up the preferences here so I can show you how easy these preferences are compared to a commercial digital audio workstation. So right off the bat, if I go here into audio, I can choose my output and input, and I can even set it to system settings, which means that if I have my interface plugged in, and so it's the thing that's working when I'm on the internet or listening to music in, I don't know, iTunes or some other MP3 player, that's what's actually also going to work inside of GarageBand. So you're not going to see that. Normally you have to configure these things manually. And then if I go into the advanced tab, here's where I set the audio resolution. So it's not as if they're giving me specific bit depth and sample rate settings that I have to choose. It actually just gives me the three options here of good, better, or best. And I'm going to go ahead and choose best. So I keep this at 24-bit across the board. Nowadays with computers, you should have no problem going 24-bit, and for the most part in professional studios, that's what they're using. But it's true, you can go ahead and get away with good, and it's not going to sound that bad. In fact, you probably won't even be able to hear that big of a difference, but it can impact the processing of the plugins themselves. So 24-bit, I'd kind of encourage that nowadays, but it's okay to work with 16-bit also. It's not going to kill anybody. So we'll go into best here and close that down. And now configuring my MIDI keyboard also couldn't be simpler. I'm just going to turn it on. Okay, so I flip on my MIDI keyboard and there we go. The number of MIDI inputs has changed. My MIDI keyboard is now set up. Couldn't be easier than that, right? So let's go ahead, and I think what I'm going to do here is add a new instrument track, just so we can see how this works and how this is quite different from a commercial digital audio workstation. So I go to create a new track. I'm going to choose a software instrument. And right away, it gives me a grand piano. So I go to my grand piano. My MIDI keyboard is working like so. And I talked about in a couple of the articles on the website about if you're a composer and you open up a DAW, it's not as if they just tell you string section here or grand piano here. But in this program, it does exactly that. So if I want to instead have a cello section, I can go to strings and let's see, here's orchestra cello section. It's going to take some time to load it in. And now I have cellos and I also have a reverb on it. So what I'm going to do is go into edit so I can actually look at the instrument settings. And now what we have are just a bunch of different, they call these sound generators, but we have a bunch of different samplers that we can choose from. So if I don't want cellos and instead I want to go with the Irish fiddle, I can click on that. It's loading in the samples. I'm getting the spinning wheel of death. And now we have the Irish fiddle. I could slow down that release. So it sounds like there's too much reverb on that, and you'll notice that the reverb doesn't exist within the effects. It actually is the master reverb, which is the equivalent of like a send and return structure. So if I want to find where that's located, I have to go to the master track, and then you can see we have these track effects, but these are hardwired in here. I can't change this from echo to something else. I can't change this from reverb to something else. All I could do is actually adjust the preset, and I'm not going to do that because for this little 8-bar loop I've created, I've actually set the settings how I've wanted them. But right away, this is a pretty big limitation. I can't add something different. I can't EQ the echo. I can't EQ the reverb. I can't use a different algorithm. I'm just stuck with whatever the built-in reverb is. But in a way, that's a good thing because it stops me from spending 2, 3, 4 hours trying to get that reverb to sound just right. if this was a professional track that was going to be released, I'd want to spend those 2, 3, 4 hours. But in this case, I'm just making music for fun. Why am I going to want to kill myself trying to get that just right? Let's speed up the process a little bit. So if I go back to my instrument here, and I go into the edit, I can choose how much reverb I want to send. I can choose none. Let's put some echo on here. Let's see how low it will play. So although the Irish fiddle may not work for this track, you can easily load that up there. The next limitation you're going to notice is the number of effect slots we have. And this is what I mentioned before. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 slots, fully customizable, except for the compressor and the visual EQ. You can see if I try to click on those, I can't change the effect. But if I go in here, I can choose whatever I want to choose from the effects. So let's just choose like the bass amp, for example. So we can greatly change this around, and then we can move these wherever we want to move these. So if I want to bring the EQ in, I even have an analyzer on it. So we can get in there and mess around and really greatly change the sound if we so choose. And then again, we can manually move these guys around. So if I want to put the amp after the EQ, I could do something like that. But again, we are limited with the number of tracks that we can set up here. And really, those are kind of the biggest limitations that exist inside of this program, at least as far as I can tell. You can load up plugins here, and we can take a look at that. Let's just go ahead here and just turn this guy off. We can go in and see that on this track, I've used a plugin here, one of these. I've used this EQ, okay, plugins. And so for the most part, I just used plugins. I also used, I think, the grand piano that comes inside of Garageband just because it was the first thing that loaded up. And if we go to the beginning, we can take a listen to what I was able to create using the samples that we're going to be using. And for the most part, the plugins that we're going to be using. I was a little more experimental with the instruments just because I could be and I had them installed. But let's go ahead and take a listen. So with automation and all of that we talked about when we were working with Soundation and Audiotool, that stuff works exactly the same way. So if I go in here, I think I have one set up. I can pull this down and you can see we have the track pan here. And that's just being very simply automated. And you can have as many automation lanes as you want. I could click add automation and then choose anything from that list. It's not as easy as just kind of selecting a parameter and being able to automate that. However, you can still automate whatever you want in the track and works like you'd expect it to work. The other thing I'll show you is that on the master track here, we have these master effects, and these 3 are all hardwired in, but personally, they're not things that I would probably use as a mastering track. So instead, I've put a plugin on here, and you can see I've just set it up really easily. I only get one slot that I can use myself, and so that's the slot that I've used, and I've put that loud max on there. So apart from that, there's really aren't that many limitations. Some things you can't do. You can't route audio around. So with these drum tracks, if it was up to me, I'd probably route them all into one audio track and then process them from there. But you can't do that inside of this program. So you have to kind of make do with it as it is. Again, like we mentioned before, nothing you can really mess around with too much with the send and returns. And otherwise, though, it's pretty much like any other digital audio workstation. The editing of the audio tracks isn't as efficient, things like that. But for the most part, if you have an idea in your head, you will still be able to execute it here inside of GarageBand. So the last thing we'll look at are the exporting features, because they're a little bit different. This program gives you the ability to export it directly to like iTunes or whatever, but we're going to go to export song to disk. And then we have different choices we can use. Now, if it's me, you're going to probably want to export it at original quality. So it's going to come out as like an AIFF file at 24-bit. I don't know what the sample rate is going to be, but you could also compress it from here if you want to do that. And you can choose to compress straight to AAC. So that's like iTunes quality, or you can go to the MP3 encoder and then you can choose their quality choices here. But you'll notice that on higher quality, it's only at 192 kilobits. So you'd want to go into custom, and then you could actually go up to like 320 and choose what you want to choose. But for our example, I would turn compress off, and then just like that, we would be able to export this and move it wherever we wanted, and we'd have our full track. So that's GarageBand in a nutshell. You can see some of those limitations, and you can also see, though, how those limitations can get you to work a little bit quicker.